thoroughly anticipate that other folks will be drifting in as the afternoon develops, in part because I know some folks have run into transportation problems. Before we begin, I do want to make one announcement because it entails a change in our plans. One of our scheduled speakers, Gavin Steingo from Princeton University, who was scheduled to speak this afternoon, is unable to be here. Unfortunately, there was a sudden death in his family. His mother passed away unexpectedly, and he was called to South Africa. So what we've decided to do is to allow a little more flexibility, a little more air and breathing time in the afternoon sessions rather than try to redefine. But for those of you who are participating in the conference, those of you who are speaking and responding and who are actively part of the conference and who will be joining us for dinner as scheduled, please know that the time for dinner has been moved from 7:30 until 7 o'clock because we now have this little extra time in the course of the afternoon. Okay? And if you have any needs for transportation or any other practical problems, please ask Alina, who is sitting here. Okay? And I suppose the next vital piece of practical thing to do is to thank Alina, who's made it all definitively possible. Although I'm going to do this again at the very end of tomorrow when we're sure that all of these things have worked perfectly. The topic for the Boundary 2 conferences is normally fairly specific. So in the last couple of years, for instance, we've had meetings in this set of rooms in this building and below us. We've had meetings on the topic of neoliberalism around the work of Philip Murawski. We had a recent conference around the general question, does anyone care about language anymore? Which became a discussion of the problems of philology and criticism and so on. Today we're departing from our usual mode. We are not setting a topic. We have not set a topic. That's consistent with the history of the journal because in the good old days, often our meetings had no set topic. What we would do was we would meet together and we would present, particularly to each other and to friends who came along, our own work in progress. And we would then have conversation, arguments. Some of the arguments were intense. Conversation and arguments which had a result too hard to overstate in helping to form the collective identity of the journal as it's developed. That identity, of course, needs constantly to be reconsidered, renewed, varied, and restored. So in the spirit of that general impulse, in part, we've gathered today, here and tomorrow, under this rubric B2, which is an online acronym for Boundary 2, merely that, attached to our website, B2 at the Twitter mark PITT. Because if you follow PITT online, that's at PITT. So what we've done is we've taken the opportunity to assemble here, to invite and to assemble here, colleagues from the University of Pittsburgh who work in areas relevant to and consistent with our concerns. By no means have we invited all such colleagues, because there would be too many, but some. We've gathered the Boundary 2 faculty colleagues in particular who have affiliations with PITT. And we have also asked, and in some cases successfully managed, to bring back to the campus folks who have either studied here and gone on to careers elsewhere, or who have taught here and gone on to careers elsewhere. So, for example, the absent Gavin Steingo made a very good career here as an assistant professor of music before moving on to Princeton. Sitting here near the front of our group is our Boundary 2 friend and colleague and former University of Pittsburgh PhD student, Kara Keeling, who's now at the University of Chicago. And some other folks, like Kara, were asked but could not come. So friends and former students who now teach at places like North Carolina, Stanford, and so on, were unable to join us. So we have no set topic. We have works in progress. We have the commonality of the journal and its intersections with the University of Pittsburgh as the occasion for conversation and I hope for intense discussion. The sessions are filled. I think of it as having a surfeit of talent, but we have now a little bit extra time. So we've asked each speaker to stay to roughly 50 minutes, and within that 50 minutes to include as much time as she or he particularly feels the need to allow conversation and discussion. So the first speaker today is Jason Fitzgerald, who is a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Theater Arts at PITT, and who represents another part of the shadow world of Boundary 2, that is to say he has a Columbia connection. He is also here with the support of a postdoctoral fellowship from the Humanities Center. He holds his PhD in theater from Columbia University's Department of English and Comp Lit, as well as an MFA in dramaturgy and dramatic criticism from the Yale School of Drama. His current book project, the title of this talk relates to it. His current book project is under the working title, Theater at the End of Humanism. And it's a book which aims to map the avant-garde theater artists of the late 60s as they grappled with forms of philosophical humanism, which they in turn inherited from what was a left-wing counterculture. This book is tracing the way those theater artists were in the process of transforming their practice while laying groundwork for more recent theoretical work. His second book, which is also underway, is going to interrogate these connections further by looking at the cultural productions about nuclear warfare. It's within a large thinking about ecology from the 50s through the 70s, as this develops and then emerges as a discourse about climate change into the 21st century. So please join me in welcoming Jason.
Thank you, Paul. Can everyone who can hear me? If I'm at this level, is this audible? Good. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Paul for inviting me to be part of this weekend. There's some familiar faces in the room and some new faces. I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you over the next 2 days, so I'm really glad to be here. The talk I'm going to share with you is in transition. It came from a dissertation chapter, which is going to become a book chapter, and in between, it's in the process of becoming an article. So I want to excuse the rough edges of the talk in that way. I'm going to start by spending some time setting up the case study for the talk, since I'm assuming that most of you are not familiar with it. And after I set it up, I'll launch into the argument properly. So the image I'm showing you here is from a play called A Black Mass, which was written in 1965 by poet, playwright, activist, and Black arts movement icon Amiri Baraka, best known to theater history for the play Dutchman, produced the previous year. Although Baraka was known as Leroy Jones until 1967, I choose to honor his chosen name, and so we'll refer to him as Baraka for this talk. The plot of the play centers on a confrontation between the two figures shown here. The man in the back is named Yakub, one of three magicians whom we meet in a prehistorical mythological space characterized at once literally and figuratively by what the stage directions call jet blackness. Yakub and his brothers, also in the play, named Nasafi and Tanzil, are responsible for maintaining order and harmony in the play's Edenic universe. But to his brother's dismay, Yakub breaks from this task and instead seeks new frontiers of human knowledge and expression. In the process, he creates the beast, who stands in the foreground of this image. The stage directions that describe the beast read as follows, quote, "The figure is absolutely cold white with red lizard devil mask, which covers the whole head and ends up as a lizard spine cape. It has webbed hands and feet, and when it is not vomiting, it is chewing and spitting, wheezing, and scratching. It speaks the same word repeatedly and loudly, white, 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 occasionally interrupted by the cry, me." Despite Yaqub's attempts to tame the creature, its murderous appetite leads it to bite and kill any human being it comes in contact with. And by the end of the plot in which it resides, the beast has turned all its fellow characters into corpses. The play ends with a narrator calling for a jihad against the beasts in our world. The play is an adaptation of the founding myth of the Nation of Islam, a myth that plays a prominent role in Elijah Muhammad's most widely read book, Message to the Black Man in America. In the official version, the rogue magician named Yaqub with a Y instead of Baraka's J is a eugenicist who creates the white race through a combination of selective breeding and infanticide over the course of 1,000 years. The black nation is cast as, quote, civilization, and its white offshoots as savages, who are, quote, like animals. The Nation of Islam's theology promises that the 6,000-year reign of this inhuman white race will soon come to a close, after which black people will restore true civilization to the planet. We'll return to the differences between Baraka's play and his source material and what follows, since I believe the choices made in the adaptation are deliberate and significant. But let us first take the play on its own. On its own, the play appears relatively simple, a polemic that is reductively illustrative even by the standards of Baraka's other plays of this period. A Black Mass appears to offer an origin story that serves the cause of black liberation by reversing the classic racist binary, marking whiteness as civilized and pure, and marking blackness as the white man's barbaric and fallen other. The limited reception history of the play has largely reaffirmed this interpretation. Few accounts remain of the play's first audiences, who were almost certainly all black. The play received its initial production at the Proctor's Theatre in New Jersey in May 1966. Once the play reached white audiences a few years later, the response was a mixture of disgust and alarm. A white drama critic and a county sheriff in Florida jointly called the play, quote, obscene and objectionable for its depiction of, quote, whites portrayed by blacks in whiteface, clothed as beasts. New York Times critic Mel Gussow similarly dismissed a 1972 production as an attack on white people, in which, quote, black man creates white man, definitely not in his own image, and then ridicules him. This take on the play is largely stuck, though there's been some division among modern critics over the virtue of the play's inversion of racist signs. Some, like Melanie McAllister, have interpreted the play as a relatively straightforward transmission of the Nation of Islam's theology, evidence of its influence in the black arts movement as a whole. Others, like Harry Elam Jr., have lamented that, quote, defining black as humanistic and white as anti-humanistic does not destroy, but instead reinforces racial absolutism, potentially reinscribing the cultural imperialist paradigms it intended to subvert. My view is that these interpretations take the play too literally, failing to consider the possibility that Baraka is engaged in a more subtle act of trickery. What gives away the game, for me, is the degree to which a play that relies so extensively on spectacle, from the ridiculous extremity of the monster's get-up, to a degree of violence that approaches camp, to its reliance on B-movie tropes, particularly the Frankenstein mad scientist, as well as on polemic, as in the narrator's call for jihad at the play's conclusion. It's amazing that such a play spends the majority of its stage time on a philosophical debate about the nature of the human. It is this quality that led to Larry Neal's overlooked gloss on the play in his manifesto, The Black Arts Movement, in which he called the play, quote, a colloquy on the nature of man. References to human and man appear on nearly every page of dialogue, much of which is devoted to a discussion among the brothers as the beast stands trapped behind an invisible cage. Their debate is over whether or not the beast is human, and so whether it should be welcomed into the universe or cast out of it. Yaqub insists that his creation, as a product of human achievement, has at least a trace of humanity within it, while his brothers refute the claim. Quote, this is a magic against humanity, Tenzil says, before calling it a monster. In defiance, Yaqub digs in his heels and calls the beast a man, to which Tenzil retorts, we are men, brother, and this thing is not ourselves, but the hatred of ourselves. Yaqub's stubborn response, "No, brothers, I will show you," is what drives him to uncage the creature and unleash destruction upon the stage. The spectacular violence then appears as secondary to the philosophical drama it frames. My argument today is that a black mass unlocks for the attentive critic a crucial stage in Amiri Baraka's political and philosophical development, because it's the play in which the author most fully works through a question that haunts him for, I think, much of the first 2 decades of his writing life, namely the relationship between an emerging black nationalism and an ideology of humanism inherited from the West, but carrying with it the values of interpersonal justice and historical progress that provide the foundation for any liberation struggle. As I believe Baraka understand the term, humanism means not simply the belief in a universalism undergirding all human beings, a human nature that supersedes ethnic, gendered, and other forms of difference. Humanism also brings with it a belief in human capacity for knowledge production and world-making, and the application of knowledge for the betterment of the world and the species. After briefly contextualizing the contested place of humanism in black liberation debates of the early 1960s, I hope to show that a black mass marks Baraka's attempt to rescue humanism by injecting it with historicization, subjecting the concept itself to a dialectical force that keeps it always in process, his words. Baraka aims to rescue humanism by opposing the reification of the human, casting as truly dangerous the forgetting of the material histories and power relations that make it possible to think any version of the human in the first place. This seems like the right time to mention that this argument derives from my current book project, which, as already described, I used to contribute to debates about humanism, anti-human, and post-humanism by tracing the effects of humanist thought in practice, revealing the potentials and the contradictions that are simultaneously born when left-wing theater makers in the late 1960s applied humanist ideologies to their stages. I present theater in the project as a privileged site for a critical approach to humanism, made possible by the dialectical tension between the material body and the aesthetic sign that is fundamental to the form. Indeed, as the history of anti-humanist thought has tried to show, idealism itself, an anti-historical dematerialization, is humanism's original sin. To use humanist terms to ground a call for justice is to assert a natural or supra-historical principle that claims to be unreliant on existing relations of power. That idealism is humanism's liability when the movement it justifies is confronted with concrete practice. But it is also the source of its remarkable power as an organizing ideology, as a tool for coalition building, and in a Cold War context, as a means of asserting a refusal of nationalist alignment while remaining rooted in moral principle. We see these first two functions play out in the work of Martin Luther King Jr., who framed the demand for civil rights by opposing humanist universalism to racist separatism and to a liberalism that excuses it. Nonetheless, in so doing, King was fighting for the citizen subject, whose recognition by the American state will register and dignify her humanity. Malcolm X, by contrast, set himself apart from King by opposing civil rights to human rights, calling for the humanity of black people to be registered by an international black nation that is not a state, but rather a coalition of oppressed peoples around the world. This rhetoric split humanism into false and true variants, the former given legs by the imperialist West and condemned by Malcolm X as whiteism, and the latter, the true humanism, not realized in any material state formation. Malcolm X was inspired, of course, by the Bandung Conference of Africans and Asians that had been held in Indonesia in 1955. Following Malcolm's lead, the Revolutionary Action Movement in 1965 dubbed the term Bandung Humanism to name an imperialist and anti-consumerist model of, quote, international freedom that could be set against, quote, Yankee inhuman oppression. The Revolutionary Action Movement called for a, quote, dialectical eschatology that by setting the Yankee as thesis and Bandung as antithesis would yield a, quote, humanistic Bandung synthesis, devoid of man's inhumanity to man. It is significant that only 1 year after so forcefully asserting the political and philosophical power of this new humanism, the revolutionary action movement dropped the term almost entirely, calling instead for revolutionary black internationalism that would serve as a, quote, revolutionary science. Dialectical humanism was then subordinated to the sociological and cultural side of the struggle, as the radical energy that first inspired RAM turned toward questions of institutional endurance and concrete political action, or what they called the, quote, material factors of the struggle. Humanism was suddenly no longer enough. Yet the question of priority between the cultural and the material was hardly settled, as the more heated conflicts between cultural nationalists and revolutionary nationalists in the years that followed would make clear.
And in CCR, and in the argument between CCR and the Pestra, and the question precisely of form. Right? Form. Yes. At the same time, Baraka was very attentive to Fanon. And the phrase that really overshadows this conversation that you're having with two of you is Je me faisais poète du monde. Right? And throughout the arc of his poetic career, Baraka's doing this. So I don't know if you paid attention to Baraka's engagement with Fanon, if you factor it in, but what I think would cause you to, if you do, kind of rethink your answers to Stasis.
Yeah, I
and the Sun Ra recording is outrageous in that regard. Right? Because, of course, it's not Afrofuturism, whatever that may mean.
Yeah, absolutely, of course.
But it indeed is emblematic of what we will call Afrofuturism, because it's about experimental form as simply the poetic creation of the world.
Exactly.
With the attitude in terms of aesthetics, and this goes back to Larry Neal, for example, of, pardon my French, fuck you. Right? Which is why it's unapologetic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And, you know.
Good, thank you.
That was a challenge.
We'll talk more. This is very interesting.
I'm going to simmer that and take more questions.
This is more of an outsider question, just looking at your presentation. Do you think it would be worth engaging with the fact of the presence of female figures in the play? And if so, how would you do it? I ask because you use the word reproduce a number of times, and most of the time had nothing to do with sexual reproduction, but that's what I was thinking about. And so, you know, to what extent can a descent into history be the kind of materialist, you know, a turn to the kind of materialist humanism that you're arguing for reading in this work, without attention to not just female figures, not just gender, but also the fact of reproduction, right? Whether it's emancipated or not.
So here's my response to thinking about the role of women in this play. I'm struggling as I write this because I'm working really hard to complicate Baraka's relationship to race and his essentialization of race. I don't find him to be so sophisticated in his treatment of gender. So I haven't found much good to say about his treatment of it, so except to say that. Here's what I will say is that the sequence where the women come on stage, they sing are asked to sing a music in order to try to recover or hold on to a kind of harmony that qualifies this timeless, prehistorical, mythic space. The beast bites one of them. She turns into this has been read by some critics as a attack on women as particularly vulnerable to assimilation and to miscegenation, and so as a first of all misogynistic moment in the play. I don't think it's not a misogynistic moment, but I don't think the misogyny is the priority, because I think what's happening here is that if the beast is to be figured through this moment or through this scene as imperialism, as conquest, as a force of conquest, the woman then becomes the field upon which conquest takes place, right? A sort of classic misogynistic trope, just of a different order. That's just to say something more about the role of women in this play, but I don't have much.
Right. But does the woman also become the ground of this reimagination of Black humanism? Right, in the same way as she's praising imperialism. And yeah, so.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think in this play, no. I wish I could give you a more sophisticated answer, but I think not in this play. I mean, Baraka had to sort of wrestle with his sort of misogyny from the 60s for the rest of his life, and that's a separate story. But I think in this play, yeah, I mean, it is interesting that the woman who plays, the actress who played the woman who was bitten by the beast in the original production was Sylvia Robinson, who became his wife, and became a sort of major figure in the Black Arts movement for the rest of their time together. And so much of his autobiography in '84 is him reckoning with, she took on the name Amina Baraka, Amina sort of calling him to recognize the importance of women and to sort of rethink the role of women in the revolution, and him saying, yes, that's right, she's right, I ought to be doing that more. So there's an interesting story around that, and the actress who plays the character. But I think just in the particular play, it hasn't quite happened yet.
That's also, I'm sorry, but that's also a very obvious, and Neil mentions this motif of rape.
Yeah, the biting.
Yeah, the biting.
That's my point.
You know, the biting, which is not miscegenation, it's the white man's rape, which produces black people. Full stop. We look the way we do for historical reasons.
Right. I'm not responding because I don't disagree.
Well, if there are no other questions,
You stopped us wrong.
No, you stopped yourselves by dancing around it.
well, the obvious.
I'll just kind of toss in, you know, in the longer version of the paper, the sort of the play that I look at next is the play Slave Ship. And I tend to see this play as Baraka sort of working out the critique. Slave Ship is working out a certain sort of vision of an alternative. And you see this in that play, which tells, well, I won't go into the plot of the play, but essentially it's sort of, its climactic moment is the coming together of all the black figures on stage who began the play as slaves coming over on the Middle Passage. They conclude the play rising up together in a line, doing a dance against their white oppressors and sort of defeating them explicitly. So it's a materialization or theatricalization of sort of the revolutionary, cultural revolution that he's imagining. And the music that the characters in that line are singing is explicitly described as a combination of the music that they inherited while in the New World, while in the US, along with the music that they brought with them from Africa, from where they came from. So it's in this sort of syncretic combination that the notion of a black nation or black cultural nation is sort of figured in Slave Ship. So I tend to see this play as kind of concluding the work with which he begins critically in A Black Mass. Again, there's probably more to say about that, but that's where I tend to go, if that's helpful.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Jonathan. There was a marginally late question. Mr. Lauer. Yes.
As the curtain was coming, but I'm thinking about the presentation as one that is engaged, very strongly with the ideological issues of the drama. Is or the performance. What I wonder is there a history of its stagings that opens up any lights along the issues that we've been thinking about with you?
All I've got so far is what I sort of referred to. So there's sort of the original production, the Proctor's Theatre, of which there's not much record, aside from the recording, which was actually made 2 years after the original production. The records that we have are from when the play toured. But actually, that incident in Florida that I referenced if I'm remembering correctly, it actually didn't make it to Florida because the play itself, the script itself, was so horrifying that the play was canceled. There was sort of Baraka and his team became sort of threatened with violence, and so they didn't come. It was performed in 1972 in New York City, and I believe a festival of Baraka's plays, if not Black Arts Brooklyn plays. And that's the production in 72 from which the images come from, and from where Gusso's phrases come from. That's what I got so far, and part of what's interesting about Gusso's response is describing the delight and the laughter of the African American members of the audience in the room, which you can tell in his tone he finds horrifying, or at least doesn't understand, which I think speaks to the way in which I think one of the things that's interesting about the play is that it does do the sort of obvious work that it seems to do when you first read it, which is to shock white audiences into seeing whiteness figured as monstrous. Right? It does do that work. But it does further work and can do further work, I think, if you look at it further. So the question of audience then becomes, I think, kind of interesting. That's all I got right now in terms of reception.
Then let's break for 2 minutes. And we have a little bit of flexibility.